All right, so today we're going to break down a pretty provocative argument made recently by columnist Des Houghton on Sky News Australia. The whole thing is built around this central idea of radical change, so let's dive in and see exactly how that argument is constructed.
So this is it. This is the phrase at the heart of the whole thing, radical change. The core claim is that Australia is going through this massive, fundamental transformation. And to make that point, the source connects three very different national issues.
So, how exactly is this case for radical change built? Well, the source presents it like a three-legged stool. Each leg represents a major national concern: mass migration, cultural influence, and economic pressure. Let's take a look at each of these pillars one by one. Okay, so the first pillar of this argument, it's all about immigration, but more specifically, it focuses on the sheer scale of recent migration into Australia and what the source claims are the national security issues tied directly to it. You can see right away how sharply the position is stated. The columnist isn't arguing against immigration in general, but against what they call mass migration. It really sets a critical tone for this whole section of the argument. So what does mass migration even mean in this context? Well, the source points to this one specific number: 400,000 people a year. That's the figure they cite for legal migration during the first 3 years of the current government. And to help you picture that, they use a pretty vivid analogy. And here's how they try to make that number feel real. The argument is that adding 400,000 people every year is like adding the entire combined populations of Toowoomba and Townsville to Australia. Every single year. The source then connects that scale directly to security concerns. So here's the crucial link they make. The argument is that with numbers that big, it's basically impossible to vet everyone properly. The segment specifically points out arrivals from Gaza and Palestine, and then brings up an ASIO figure of 200 people on a terrorism watch list as evidence to back up this concern. All right, let's move on to the second pillar and see how the argument builds from here. It shifts from demographics over to culture, and it does that by using a case study from the United Kingdom to raise some questions about what could happen here in Australia. The anchor for this part of the argument is the number 85. Now, according to the segment, a Conservative MP told the UK's House of Commons that there are 85 Sharia courts currently up and running in Britain. Then, the segment goes into what these courts are said to do. So the concern being raised here is kind of two-sided. On the one hand, these courts reportedly deal with civil stuff, property disputes, marriage, inheritance. But on the other hand, the source highlights these deep fears that they could usurp Crown law and enshrine bad values, all because they operate totally outside of the official state legal system. And that's how they bring it all back home. The source doesn't just use the UK as a cautionary tale. It poses this direct, rhetorical question. Could this already be happening in Australia? This is what links that overseas example right back to the central theme of change here at home. Okay, that brings us to the third and final pillar of the argument, and this one shifts gears into economics. The focus here is on government policy, the national debt, and the chain reaction of consequences the columnist believes is going to follow. This quote really sets the tone for the whole economic critique. The columnist describes the government's fiscal policy as a tax and spend abyss, basically saying that it's this addiction to spending that's put the country in a really tough financial spot. And the headline figure used to back this up, and I mean, it's a big one, is the national debt. The source says it has now blown past $1 trillion. This massive number is presented as the root cause of a whole bunch of difficult choices and future problems. So the source lays out this really clear chain of events, a kind of cause and effect. The argument goes, the trillion-dollar debt will inevitably lead to less money for crucial things like defense, the NDIS, and childcare. And because of that, the government will be forced to hunt for new money, which could lead to policy changes like messing with negative gearing. But what about the government's official reason for these kinds of potential tax changes? Tackling intergenerational inequality. Well, the columnist just dismisses that. It's described as nothing more than code words for socialist meddling in the marketplace, basically framing it as an ideological move, not a necessary economic one. So there we have it, the three pillars: migration, culture, and economics. But how do they all connect? Let's take a look at how the source weaves these different threads together into that single story of radical change. See, the whole point of the argument is that these are not just separate, isolated issues.
They're presented as interconnected forces, all pushing the country in the same direction. The combination of what's called unchecked migration, the potential for foreign influence on our laws, and unsustainable economic policy, well, in this narrative, it all points to a massive, radical shift for the nation.
And this all leads to the final, really dramatic statement from the segment. It completely reframes the whole debate. The suggestion is that the biggest threats aren't coming from the outside, but from the inside, from the very policies and changes we've just been talking about. And that's really where the argument leaves you. After breaking down all these claims about migration, culture, and the economy, we end up with this final provocative question. It ultimately asks you, the viewer, to decide if you agree with that final assessment.